Okay, let's take a look at the ear on this 3B model. So the ear can be divided up into three major gross anatomical components. So there's going to be the external ear. So the external ear is going to include the auricle here that is going to help funnel the sound waves into this auditory tube, which is the external acoustic or auditory meatus. And that's going to be the first component of the ear, which is the external ear. The tympanic membrane here, or the eardrum, is going to be the boundary between the external ear and the middle ear cavity. We can see some other structures here that aren't relevant to the auditory system, but are relevant to this anatomical area. So we can see some cartilage patches here. This type of cartilage is going to be elastic cartilage. So elastic cartilage is going to be found in the 3 E's of the body. So the ear, the auricle, is movable, right? It's flexible. That's due to the characteristics of the elastic fibers within the elastic cartilage. We're also going to find it in the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is that flap that folds down over your trachea when you swallow to prevent the aspiration of food or beverage down your trachea. And then also the eustachian tube, or the pharyngeotympanic tube, and that's located here on the model. So this is going to be the tube that helps equilibrate the pressure between the pharyngeal region in your neck and the middle ear cavity when you are rising in elevation on an airplane, for example. So if you've ever been in an airplane and you start rising in elevation, you notice that your tympanic membrane or your eardrum will pop. And that's due to the change in the pressure, the differential in pressure between your external ear and your middle ear. And so when you plug your nose and force air through this pharyngeotympanic tube, then you can pop your eardrum back into place by equilibrating the pressure between the middle ear cavity here and the external ear. So those are the 3 places where you can find elastic cartilage: the ear, the epiglottis, and the eustachian tube. Okay, back to some of the structures that are going to be more relevant to the auditory system, as well as the vestibular system. So once we get to the area of the tympanic membrane, we are now in the area of the middle ear cavity. So this external portion, or more lateral portion, of the tympanic membrane is the boundary between the middle ear cavity and the external ear. And so this side of the tympanic membrane will be in the middle ear cavity. But there are going to be 3 bony structures that we can see here. These are the smallest bones in the body. They're called the ossicles. And these are going to help transduce sound waves as those waves travel through the external auditory meatus to the tympanic membrane, which will vibrate at the frequency of that particular sound wave, and then transmit that sound frequency through these bony ossicles. So there's a series of 3 here. There's the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. So the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup are the common names. Malleus, incus, and stapes are the Latin names. Okay, so the stapes, or the stirrup, is going to abut a structure called the oval window. And the oval window is going to be the boundary between the middle ear cavity and the internal ear. But again, another component of the middle ear will be this eustachian tube, or pharyngeotympanic tube, which helps equilibrate the pressure between the pharyngeal region and the middle ear cavity. Okay, so on to the internal ear. And for the internal ear, I'm going to transition over to a larger SAMSO model, which depicts these structures at a larger scale. So on this model, we can see the components of the internal ear. So this snail-like structure, the apex of it is going to be pointing anteriorly here. So the snail-like structure is the cochlea. That's going to be responsible for transducing sound waves to the brain. So if we look back on the 3B model, we can see that we have the tympanic membrane, the ossicles, the last one being the stapes here that will abut the oval window. Well, when this stapes moves at the frequency of the sound wave that has been transmitted to this point, it's going to send those sound vibrations into the fluid that will be found in the cochlea. And there will be a model that I'll follow up with here that will show you what the internal aspects of the cochlea look like when those sound waves are traveling through it, and what sensory organ, specifically the organ of Corti, will be, and how it sends its message to the CNS. But first, let's take a look at some of these vestibular structures. So these vestibular structures are going to be involved with telling our brains about the position of our head in space. So this is the anterior semicircular canal. And in the internal aspect of this semicircular canal, there's going to be a fluid called endolymph that will move when the head moves in a particular direction. So when you're shaking your head yes, this anterior semicircular canal will experience the endolymph moving most freely. When you're shaking your head no, this lateral semicircular canal will experience the endolymph moving in its greatest capacity. And when you're tilting your head from side to side, this posterior semicircular canal will experience the fluid moving with the most ease. And so the differential between the fluid moving through these three semicircular canals will give us an idea of where our head is in space. This area of the internal ear is called the vestibule. There's going to be the utricle, which is positioned more superiorly, and the saccule, which is positioned more inferiorly. And these two structures are going to respond to linear acceleration. So the utricle, which is positioned more superiorly here, that's going to respond to acceleration along the x-axis. So you can think utricle uber. So when you're accelerating in an uber, it's going to be this utricle that will respond to that acceleration along the x-axis in a horizontal plane. The structure positioned more inferiorly here is the saccule. So that's going to respond to acceleration along the y-axis. And so you can think of saccule, sack of groceries, lifting up a sack of groceries, because this is going to detect acceleration along the y-axis. So if you take one of those amusement park rides and they take you up to a very high elevation and then drop you, it's going to be this saccule that responds to that acceleration along the y-axis. If we flip around this model, we can see the cochlear portion of cranial nerve 8. So that's the vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 8. But there are going to be two components of it. There's the cochlear portion, and then there's going to be the portion that serves the vestibular apparatus. And that's going to be the vestibular portion of cranial nerve 8. Okay, so that is the internal ear. But like I mentioned, I want to show you what's going on inside the cochlea. So this gives us somewhat of a clear picture of what's going on inside the cochlea, but there's a model that takes this view and expands it. So we're going to take a look at another SAMSO model here that will show us a cross section through the cochlea. So it's going to be a picture just like this, but at a larger scale. Okay, so here we are in the cochlea that has been sectioned in a cross section. We can see three different chambers here. So there's what's called the Scala vestibuli here, the Scala Tympani here, and the Scala Media here. And there are going to be different types of fluid in these two chambers versus this chamber. So in the Scala vestibuli and the Scala Media, there's going to be perilymph. But in the Scala Media, there's going to be endolymph. And so when sound waves are passing through the endolymph within the Scala Media, it's going to get to a particular portion of the cochlea that is receptive to particular frequencies of sound. So higher frequencies of sound versus low frequencies of sound are going to be picked up at different locations along the cochlea. So in this particular area of the cochlea, if the frequency is conducive to the organ of Corti here responding to it, it will pick up that frequency of sound. And it will move relative to a structure here called the tectorial membrane. And so these hair cells will depolarize and send their messages through cranial nerve 8 here, specifically the cochlear portion of cranial nerve 8, to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. This is the basilar membrane. This is going to be the structure upon which the organ of Corti will reside. Okay, those are the relevant structures on the models for the auditory system.